Hi, everyone, and welcome to this morning's ICIS Forum on the future of Malaysia's international climate commitments. I'm Darshan Joshi, and I'm an analyst with ICIS Malaysia. I'm just going to give a quick background to the discussion before I introduce our speakers and Mr. Alizan Mahadi, who will give the opening remarks. So as the world prepares for COP26, attention is increasingly growing towards the commitments that countries are willing to make to further global progress towards meeting the Paris Agreement targets. Now, the main Paris Agreement target is to limit global warming to well below 2 degrees Celsius above pre-industrial levels. And these national commitments, which are officially termed Nationally Determined Contributions, or NDCs, are required by the Paris Agreement to be updated every 5 years. So the Paris Agreement was agreed in 2015, and it's been 5 years since then, owing to the 1 year off because of COVID. So accordingly, as of May of this year, some 65 countries or blocs had proposed or submitted new commitments, including your bigger global players like China, the EU, and the US, but also some members of ASEAN, such as Brunei, Cambodia, Singapore, Thailand, and Vietnam, have all submitted updated NDCs. Now, these NDCs are important because in many countries, including in Malaysia, NDCs sort of set the tone and ambition for our national level climate-related policies. So this includes the policies within sectors like agriculture, energy, transport, and waste that aim to reduce our emissions. And this also includes more blanket policy options, such as carbon pricing, the levels of investment we see devoted towards climate change adaptation, and so forth. So Malaysia is yet to announce any changes to its Paris Agreement pledge to reduce the emissions intensity of GDP by 35% by 2030 relative to 2005. This target, however, overlooks the root cause of climate change, which is total emissions. This is because as long as the growth rate of GDP exceeds the growth rate of emissions, our emissions intensity of GDP will decrease. So even if we don't take action to reduce our dependence on fossil fuels, for example. And right now, somewhere between 92 and 95% of our electricity is derived from either coal, natural gas, or oil. So perhaps this target does not necessarily incentivize the adoption of low carbon practices and low carbon technologies that are crucial when it comes to addressing climate change. So the aim of this webinar is to explore the potential avenues that Malaysia can take to further its climate ambitions. We'll see a discussion of the variety of targets that are employed by different countries around the world. And this includes, but it's not limited to, commitments to boost renewable energy capacity or employ carbon pricing mechanisms, targets to achieve carbon neutrality or net zero emissions, or even a peaking of total emissions. And what we hope is to close by highlighting a realistic but still meaningful set of NDCs that Malaysia can and should employ to signal a greater commitment to addressing the issue of climate change. So our esteemed speakers today include Datin Sri Sunita Rajakumar, who is the chairman and founder of Climate Governance Malaysia, Ms. Lakshmi Lavanya Rama Iyer, who is the head of policy and climate change at WWF Malaysia, Ms. Meena Raman, who is head of programs and the coordinator of climate change program at Third World Network Malaysia. And opening remarks will be delivered by Mr. Alizan Mahadi, who is the senior director of research at ICIS Malaysia. So with that, I'll hand over to Alizan for his opening remarks.
Thank you, Darshan. Distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, a very good morning to all and welcome to the ICIS Malaysia webinar on the future of Malaysia's international climate commitments. Now, climate change, I'm sure all of you agree by now, is quite literally a hot debate. This is now obvious by just scanning the news and current affairs. For example, the recently concluded G7 summit, where climate change was one of the topics that were at the absolute top of the agenda. Even the NATO summit recently concluded included a climate action plan as one of its outcomes. And various other international summits and meetings would now, most of the time, include climate change as one of the key agendas. But as the consensus builds on the reality of climate change and its impacts, many questions are still left unanswered. In particular, the question of how do we address climate change still remains. More importantly, also the question of who is responsible and for what. And as an outcome, who will be the winners and who will be the losers? In reality, there will always be winners and losers. Can we achieve a just transition? In the international arena, the issue of climate change has always been framed as a battle between developed versus developing country, the global north against the global south, Annex 1 against non-annex countries, for those familiar with the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change, UNFCCC. So towards this end, climate agreements have recognized the principle of common but differentiated responsibilities to have some differentiation in the level of responsibility of nations. So while the Paris Agreement was a landmark in global climate action, the devil, as you all know, is in the details. And there remains many disagreements when you look at the details. So some of this includes historical responsibility versus current responsibility. For those familiar with climate change, we all know that the carbon emissions, CO2, greenhouse gas emissions, they are long-lived greenhouse gases. And once they are emitted, they can remain in the atmosphere for hundreds of years. And many developed nations have been emitting greenhouse gases to support the economy for a number of years. In this sense, those with higher cumulative emissions should take more responsibility if we were to follow this common but differentiated responsibilities or CBDR principle. Secondly, and related to that are some of the targets set, some that are mentioned by Darshan earlier. One of the goals of the upcoming COP26 at the UNFCCC is to secure a global net zero emission by 2050. And this is in line with the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, or IPCC report, that highlights the projection to avoid dangerous climate change, limiting warming to 1.5 degrees. It will require net zero emissions by 2050 to be met globally. However, note that the recommendations is for global net zero emissions, not for countries to set national net zero emissions targets, whereby if, once again, the principle of CBDR is applied, this would mean developed nations should maybe achieve this net zero emissions earlier. Thirdly is the question of finance, and in particular, who is to finance climate actions? Developing countries argue that developed countries have an emissions debt, if you like, to pay. Developed nations have pledged to set aside $100 billion per year for climate financing, but that has not been forthcoming, though this has been reiterated at the G7 recently. Fourth, and one emerging issue, is also trade. For example, the EU has made proposals for carbon adjustment border mechanisms, where example is carbon tax can be applied to products, goods, and services that are exported to EU countries. So some argue that this may fall foul of trade, WTO rules. It will create trade barriers and discriminate against countries that could not comply. And once again, this would also fall foul of the CBDR principle. Proponents though say that this will avoid carbon leakages. So ultimately, these are very tough questions that surrounds equity, that surrounds fairness, that surrounds justice. And this brings us to the context of Malaysia and the topic for today. In this complex landscape, how does Malaysia respond and design its future climate actions and ambitions? What should be Malaysia's commitments at the international level? On the one hand, Malaysia is a developing country, a non-annexed country. So is it fair to ask Malaysia to show the same level of ambition, or at least nearing to that of developed nations, when our cumulative CO2 is relatively small? On the other hand, Malaysia is in a unique situation. As a mega biodiverse country, our natural ecosystems, and in particular our forests, act as important carbon sinks. For example, in the debate of net zero emissions, Malaysia was a net zero emitter only in 2004 due to the ability of our forests to remove carbon from the atmosphere. Furthermore, Malaysia is a trading nation, and as markets respond to strict requirements on climate change, as well as potential measures, as I mentioned, such as the border adjustment mechanisms, should Malaysia show climate leadership with ambitious targets to respond to the market? These are some of the important questions for Malaysia, as currently we are in the process of updating the nationally determined contributions to the UNFCCC in the run-up to COP26. So to discuss this very complex topic, we have with us very esteemed speakers, as mentioned by Darshan. We have Datin Sri Sunita Rajakumar from Climate Governance Malaysia to perhaps give some views from the private sector, Ms. Lavanya Ramaya from WWF Malaysia to give views from the civil society perspective, and Ms. Mina Rahman from Third World Network to provide her views perhaps from a civil society and a more global perspective. I would like to thank the speakers in advance for agreeing to share your views today, and I truly look forward to your thoughts on this important and timely debate. With that, once again, thank you for joining us today, and I hope all of you at home will benefit from the webinar today. These are tough questions to untangle, but at ICES Malaysia, we hope to provide the space and platform to have such a debate on matters of national and global concern. Now, Darshan, I hand it over back to you to conduct this session moving forward. Thank you very much.
Okay, so thank you, Alizan, for your remarks. What I'll do now is I will hand over to Datin Sri Sunita, who will be the first speaker, followed by Ms. Lavanya and then Ms. Meena. So you may take the floor, Datin Sri Sunita.
Thank you so much, Darshan. And thank you so much to Alizan too, ISIS, for having me here. I have to confess that when they first invited me, I nominated all sorts of other people whom I felt were going to be much more capable than me, but I'm still here today. And so please consider me to be the light entertainment before the real experts come on. So I'd like to approach this in two parts, why this is happening and how we could address this. So what's pushing this conversation along? What are the tailwinds that has resulted in this conversation gathering so much momentum in the last 12 to 18 months? Despite an overwhelming majority of scientists having said this for decades, we're getting much more independent reporting now on the effects and implications. Most recently, Dr. Fateh Birol at the Independent Energy Agency has actually come out with a report categorically stating that we cannot have any new developments of fossil fuel assets starting from this year. In addition, private sector is also observing the massive diplomatic push prior to COP26. This has become a top diplomatic priority for many embassies, many of whom are our major trading partners, representing 70% of global emissions. Our position in the global supply chain is vulnerable. And the recent G7, as Alizan mentioned, also resolved no funding of new coal plants. So some companies are describing this potentially as the weaponizing of ESG. In addition, we're also seeing critical framework components falling into place, whether it is international disclosure standards, for example, TASB IFRS Foundation, the recent Securities Exchange Commission consultation in the US that just closed, or institutional investors agitating that accounting assumptions need to be aligned to Paris. And of course, Bill Winter's Task Force for Scaling of Voluntary Carbon Markets, which are racing to conclude by COP26. We also see that 9 out of 10 largest economies are staked to net zero goals. And investors are mobilizing as never before. They are calling for credible transition plans from all stakeholders. These transition plans are going to reveal the leaders and the laggards, because we don't want to be using tomorrow's money to fund yesterday's technologies and businesses. And we are seeing an ever lengthening tail of technologically obsolescent solutions and assets. So when you have investors and citizens recognizing the direct causality between human actions under cover of corporations and limited liability and the massive polluting footprint which is causing the triple crisis of climate, biodiversity, and pollution. And this is also being recognized by governments and courts, most recently with Exxon, the shareholders meeting, where 3 directors were appointed to the board against the preference of the management. And this was until recently the most valuable listed company in the US. Or Shell, where the Dutch court instructed it to reduce its emissions based on the 2019 baseline by 45% by 2030. So when we are not pricing in the cost of pollutants or environmental destruction, which critically impairs our ability to be resilient, are we misstating the earnings of corporations worldwide? So this is what Climate Governance Malaysia tries to turn the spotlight on. And we have a few upcoming webinars that addresses whether legal primers, sustainability, in particular from the Nordic perspective, and we have some primers on carbon. Legal primers because many directors are unaware of how this risk relates to their legal duties and disclosure obligations. And sustainability because it needs to be embedded into the DNA of the organization, because even reporting and disclosure will be insufficient. Climate absolutely needs to be mainstreamed. Part of the worry is that the first real tsunami that we're facing might not be the climate emergency, but capital markets pulling this risk forward, leading to a host of implications. For example, downgrade of sovereign ratings, withdrawal of reinsurers from this market. Swiss Re has already identified Malaysia, Indonesia as one of the most vulnerable in their universe of 48 countries to a combination of climate risk factors, which would lead to our foreign exchange weakening, our cost of debt increasing, the majority of our trading partners being unable to incorporate our country into the supply chain. So this is the why this has become crucial right now. So how, if it can't be argued that climate risks are not hugely material, that the climate emergency and decarbonization affects all of us, that the energy transition, which the world has committed to implementing, is rewiring our economic DNA, it is hard to see how any sector is going to be untouched. So cumulatively, businesses, as the largest emitters in every country, are also having to demonstrate thought leadership in this scenario of a classic market failure, where the costs of polluting and damage to the environment are borne by society at large, but profits are reaped by the polluters. So the private sector needs to make certain judgments around the climate crisis, whether it's going to be positioned on the right or wrong side of climate history, because it is going to be impossible to say that one didn't realize the enormity of this crisis. And for this, we need a high degree of confidence in stated national ambition and the close involvement of private sector or industries with a sound understanding of public sentiment to help solve these issues, whether the ideation stage, the financing stage, or the implementation stages. There is an urgent need for an alignment of government policy between economic, climate, and energy priorities, viewed against a backdrop of socio-economic well-being of citizens. So governments play a key role in signaling policy direction to the private sector. And one of the most important signals is the NDCs, to enable them to develop capacity, anticipate impending policies and regulation, because when government policy is explicit and relatively predictable, whether the price of carbon or shadow pricing, regulation on internal combustion engines, or a roadmap for hydrogen, then we can rely on the private sector to act to enable a smooth transition for businesses and the public alike. So government needs to have a clear vision and supportive policies and regulatory framework. There is sufficient capital in the world, but how does it meet except on fertile ground? Given that climate change is an existential risk, far-reaching in breadth and scope, it follows that many of those companies that are part of the solution are going to create enormous value. And many sectors are increasingly focused on this opportunity of a lifetime. So CGM has initiated a series of roundtable engagements with multiple ministries and across multiple industry sectors with as many key stakeholders as possible to discuss the impacts of climate ambition and what policies might help to facilitate this transition. I'm deeply grateful to the generous time extended by so many people so far. So CGM, we've run almost 70 events since it was launched. We have 1,400 subscribing to the newsletter with an average open rate of 50%. We're collaborating closely with the CEO Action Network, which has 45 entities signed up now, represented by CEOs and their directors, all seeking increased sustainability ambition. There is an alphabet soup of associations, alliances, and networks such as REDA, Green RE, Maria, and we're very pleased especially to have support from senior civil servants. And in particular, in the last few days, I've had long conversations with the TKSP of Policy from Ministry of Finance, Puan Zakia. She was previously at EPU. She works 11-hour days regularly, and she is intent on incorporating sustainability into Budget 2022, working more closely with DOSM for better data. She will be speaking at next Tuesday's roundtable. And of course, our perennial champion at CASA, the TKSU, Dr. Nagu, who is going to be speaking at the upcoming JC3 conference on how financial institutions could mainstream biodiversity. So I'll leave my notes here for now and tackle questions later, but I hope this has given you a good perspective of why private sector views this as a priority. Thank you.
Thank you, Datan Sri Sunita, for that fantastic overview of what the private sector can do. And you mentioned, one of the things you mentioned was the opportunity. We usually frame climate change from the perspective of the threats, but there's also enormous opportunities that come with the energy transition, the low carbon transition, the technological transition. So there's a lot for us to actually look forward to taking advantage of. With that, I'm gonna hand over to Ms. Lavanya, who will be the second speaker to give her opening remarks. Thank you, Ms. Lavanya.
Hi, thank you very much, Darshan. Thank you, Alizan, and good morning, everybody. Thanks very much for organizing this event and also for inviting WWF Malaysia to participate. I think, I would like to open by asking a few questions. Okay, what is the root cause of climate change? Now, you may wish to share your views on this in the chat box, but of course, I think we all know it. And the effects or the contribution of anthropogenic emissions, right? And our efforts currently are focused on addressing these, the greenhouse gas emissions, carbon dioxide, methane, nitrous oxide, and other greenhouse gases. But really, after almost 30 years of this, since 1992, how far have we come in truly addressing the issue? Presently, we are on course for a very inhospitable world for our species, the human species, by the end of the century. But that's not going to happen just at the end of the century, as we all know, it's already happening. Science says we have to cap global temperature rise by the end of the century to 1.5 degrees from pre-industrial times. And global, that's in the 1800s. Global average temperature has already increased by 1 degree Celsius to date. So how much more space do we have? According to the IPCC, if we proceed business as usual, as we're doing now, the remaining carbon budget or the atmospheric space to absorb emissions will be depleted within the next 11 to 12 years. So we are really in a race against time for our very own survival. Because science says that beyond 1.5 degrees, things are going to get just very inhospitable. For example, in a 2-degree world even, coral reefs are going to be almost completely destroyed, which means our fish resources are going to be adversely affected. So there's a domino effect that follows on. So 1.5 degrees has been determined by science as the really the maximum that we can afford to increase temperature by. So are we doing enough? Is the severity of the situation truly appreciated? If we look at the collective emissions reduction pledges, which are known as NDCs, as you heard, the answer would be, I believe, a resounding no. Even including the recent net zero pledges by some countries, some estimates show we will be breaching that safety net of 1.5 degrees for sure, and we are still on a trajectory to about 2.5 degree temperature rise. So certainly mitigation ambition is important, but this must be done in a systemic way, providing holistic solutions. In that context, the other side of the coin, the poorer twin in this equation, if I may say so, is adaptation, and that is equally critical. Why do I say poorer twin? Well, climate action attention has been disproportionately given to mitigation measures so far. That dynamic, sure, is slowly shifting as all countries, rich and poor alike, have been facing increasingly severe extreme weather events, even as the more pervasive slow onset events like sea level rise silently occur in the background. But is it shifting fast enough? That is my second question. Now, according to World Bank data, Malaysia's annual carbon dioxide emissions, and carbon dioxide makes up the highest proportion, about 75% of the greenhouse gas emissions of Malaysia. Carbon dioxide emissions in 2017 was 0.7% of the global total, while the cumulative emissions over time, i.e. from the beginning of the industrial era in the 1800s, what is known as total emissions that includes historical emissions, okay, all that's been accumulating in the atmosphere since industrial times, is about 0.35% of the global total. That was the value in 2019. So with this background, even if Malaysia erases all our historical emissions, while every bit of contribution definitely matters and everyone must step up and do as much as possible, if not more, it amounts to a 0.35% of historical emissions, total emissions. So strategically speaking, what should Malaysia invest its limited resources on? This is my third question. So I hope to provide my views to these three questions in the rest of this intervention. What is the root cause of climate change? Is there sufficient attention to climate adaptation? And in the context of a country like Malaysia, a developing country with limited resources, where should we strategically focus? We are also exposed to climate impacts. So the root cause I would offer that this is really our, as a species, our global disconnect to nature. In a way, this disconnect started at about the time we discovered the power of the sun stored in fossils of a species that once ruled the world in a past era, the dinosaurs. With that discovery, we started down a rabbit hole where where our respect and of our connection and interdependence with nature started diminishing. So we started becoming, thinking of ourselves as overlords, lording over nature rather than working with nature, being part of nature. So it is imperative in order to address this problem that we reconnect back with nature. Hence, this year is a very special one as we have all three Rio summits having their conferences, climate, biodiversity, and desertification Rio conventions. And it is encouraging to see there is growing momentum in building synergies between the outcomes of these meetings by the host countries. From the climate side, the host country UK has made nature a central theme for discussions at the COP, and in Kunming, the Chinese government is hosting the Biodiversity Convention to come up with really monumental new arrangements to halt and reverse the alarming loss of nature and biodiversity that we are witnessing today. These issues are certainly interlinked, as nature is our key ally, and natural systems provide the most comprehensive and effective defense mechanism to all the problems we face, including climate change. We can discuss this more during the Q&A. Now, the second question on whether we are moving fast enough on adaptation to protect ourselves from climate impacts as we take action to mitigate or reduce further emissions. We heard about the 100 billion finance pledge, which unfortunately has still not been delivered, although it was supposed to have already been delivered last year. Most of this is still focused, however, on mitigation. And adaptation really is only slowly gaining traction now. Now, this imbalance in terms of financing adaptation measures in the local context, addressing loss and damage, building capacity, and sharing technology really needs to be ramped up. We need to have a proper focus on both these interlocking issues, mitigation and adaptation. We cannot do one without the other. Each is needed. If you just focus on mitigation, there'll be need for more adaptation. If you just focus on adaptation, there'll be need for more mitigation. But with the balance, you can have less of both ultimately. So this brings me to how we link these two things together, and nature actually provides a very strong solution to this. Adaptation using ecosystem-based approaches, which harness nature's powers, nature's services to deliver on a variety of things. Now, in adaptation, it's called ecosystem-based approach, and now we are also hearing this terminology, nature-based solutions, which really serves to harness again nature to address a menu of different societal challenges. Climate change being one of them, climate adaptation and mitigation both being addressed by nature-based solutions, but also other very important societal challenges like meeting food security, meeting water security, health, and so on. So we need to look at nature-based solutions as in a way, a magic bullet that provides, if we manage nature properly, it provides a variety of benefits that address a lot of the problems that we're facing today. Now, we can discuss that also further if you like in the Q&A. Now, in the context of a country like Malaysia with limited resources, therefore, where should we strategically focus our attentions? I believe, given that we are already facing impacts, we are expected to face future impacts. Southeast Asia under the IPCC assessments has come out many times as being one of the regions that will be most severely affected by climate change. Our focus should be on adaptation. With limited resources, we have to protect, what we have built up, protect our developmental gains. So it is good to see that our NDC actually has a part on adaptation. Not all countries have this, but we do have a part on adaptation. And what we understand is the government is at the present undertaking an effort to enhance the NDC, and adaptation is still to be maintained. What we understand is that enhancement is to communicate better what our NDC was meant to achieve, and that is a very useful focus, especially in looking at what our adaptation needs are and how we can balance that limited resources in making sure that our country stays on course as we take collective action to reduce emissions into the future. So in order to support this, we have to have a long-term view as well as a more long-term view as well as a more immediate view. And for these kind of things where we talk about increasing our mitigation ambition, really a country like Malaysia should study the implications and come up with measures that are supported and meaningful for that transition to be smooth, for that transition to be effective, and for that balance between where mitigation and adaptation efforts should be invested, be made in a cohesive, comprehensive, integrated manner. So in terms of Malaysia, I'm happy to say that to support this, WWF Malaysia and the Boston Consulting Group, BCG, we have undertaken to do a study to see what are the optimal pathways for Malaysia to achieve net zero emissions economy. Okay, so we are studying this with the idea of providing the outputs of that study, which will look at the implications, socioeconomic implications, jobs, GDP growth, as well as the opportunities. Certainly, many opportunities exist for this transition. We are looking at this from a macroeconomic perspective and offering this as a resource to the country in charting our future emissions reduction path and in upgrading or increasing ambition in future NDCs. So this is going to be and it already has started, and as we continue, we will continue to engage with a wide stakeholder group. So we hope that we'll be meeting some of you, the audience here, in discussions to go really deep into the issue to see what we can collectively contribute to Malaysia in making this transition. So perhaps with that, let me stop now, and we can discuss later during the Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Lavanya, for a very detailed discussion, and definitely that study to achieve net zero in Malaysia between WWF and BCG. That sounds very interesting. I look forward to seeing the results of that. So now we'll move on to Ms. Meena Raman, our final speaker, who will be issuing her remarks now. I believe you have slides as well, Ms. Meena. You could get them.
Thank you, moderator, and good morning to all of you. And I'm very happy to see such a large turnout. And also thank you to ISIS for inviting us. Can I have my slides, please? Yeah, I just want to explain a little bit about Third World Network. We are going to be talking about the international context as what the other speakers have already laid out, a lot of the Malaysian context. And I think some of you have also heard the international context. So Third World Network is actually a Malaysian-based international organization, and we have been taking part in the UNFCCC negotiations right from Bali until even now. And currently, as you know, the final closing of the subsidiary body meetings is happening as we speak. Next, please. Next slide. Yeah. Now, I just want to put the context of this is international cooperation. As others have said, the Paris Agreement is actually about enhancing the implementation of the convention. This itself was heavily negotiated. And the idea is actually to hold temperature rise to well below 2 degrees and to pursue efforts to limit 1.5, increase the ability to adapt to the adverse impacts, which is adaptation, and also make climate finance flows consistent with low emissions pathway and climate resilient development, implemented to reflect equity and common but differentiated responsibility in light of different national circumstances. A lot here. I won't go through all the details, but I will outline a lot of that tension. The international fight has been a North-South fight. Next slide. Now, the NDC communication and the legal status of it. Many of the previous speakers have referred to this. Now, the legal aspect of this is that for parties with a 10-year NDC, which is what Malaysia offered in terms of its nationally determined contribution from 2021 to 2030, what they are supposed to do is to communicate or update by 2020 these contributions. Now, this is a request. It's not a requirement. It's not mandatory, but it's voluntary. Of course, there is a lot of political momentum to raise the ambition. Particularly, the focus is on mitigation. Rightly so, in the sense of what we know in terms of all the low ambition. But I think it's very important to also recognize the aspect of the means of implementation and ambition on that, on the finance, on the technology transfer, as well as addressing adaptation and loss and damage. So the next communication of the NDCs will be in 2025 for the next NDC, which will start from 2031 onwards. So discussions are now ongoing at COP26 as to whether there should be a common time frame for all NDCs. That is a single time frame of 5 years or 10 years, or is this up to parties to choose? This is a very heated debate, and how it's going to resolve in COP26, we will see. Next. Now, Lavanya already talked about the shrinking carbon budget. I think this is an absolute important understanding because there is a limited carbon budget. And for a 50% probability of keeping warming below 1.5, the global carbon budget is 480 gigatons only. Yeah. At the current rate of emissions, 42 gigatons per year, this budget would be consumed in 12 years, as Lavanya also was indicating. And for a 50% probability of limiting the temperature rise to 2 degrees, the carbon budget is about 1,400 gigatons. It gives you a more space. But unfortunately, again, as Lavanya has said, the guardrail is actually 1.5 because otherwise there will be tipping points, and we're already facing that. The current pledges under the Paris Agreement, the NDCs, take us to a 3 to 5 degree world. So with the shrinking carbon budget, the right approach ought to be one where rich developed world takes the lead with much deeper cuts in their emissions than is currently in their NDCs, and to provide the finance, the technology, and the capacity building needed for the developing countries to go the low emissions pathway with greater speed. Next, please. Next slide here. So in the run-up to the Paris Agreement, there were proposals from some developing countries on the concept of equitable access to atmospheric space. This approach actually advanced a top-down approach in distributing the remaining carbon space under a 1.5 or a 2 degree limit, taking into account historical cumulative emissions on a per capita basis, and to arrive at a fair shares approach reflecting the equity principle. This sounds really good, because if the world came together, how do you distribute the remaining carbon budget in an equitable way? Next slide. Now, there was opposition to a fair shares approach by developed countries. The US, the developed countries led by the US, were opposed to the fair shares approach. They did not want any international system to determine what each country must do, and pushed the pledge and review approach, which is now called the nationally determined contribution. It's a bottom-up approach. Yeah, countries define what they would do on their own in a bottom-up fashion, not based on any carbon budget analysis. So instead of respecting the equity principle of common but differentiated responsibilities and respective capabilities in the convention and the Paris Agreement between developed and developing countries, the efforts were actually to wipe away historical responsibility and advance an approach which is about common and shared responsibility. A massive, massive effort. This we need to understand, meaning both the developed and developing countries are at the same starting point, that you start at the same point in 2020 and post 2020. So you address the emissions gap to limit the temperature without looking at the history. So this violates the equity principle of the Paris Agreement. If you look at what equality and equity is, equality is different, equity is different. So those who are in a lesser stage of development or are not able to meet who are not rich and who are poor, they are supposed to be given equity. I mean, equity should be operationalized to ensure that they are able to do the massive transformation as we need to do. Next. Now there's a big discourse. I mean, my colleagues have already said that this global push for net zero. Now, many companies and many corporations and the UK government is making this a big deal. Now, many of us in civil society, climate justice groups have criticized this, that far from signifying climate ambition, the notion of net zero is really delaying much needed real zero emissions on the part of rich countries and as an effort to evade historical responsibility, shift the burdens onto the poor, disguise climate action, or even to justify the continued scaling up of extraction and burning of fossil fuels. So the net zero for developed countries is viewed as being contrary to what must be done from a fair shares perspective. And what is this net zero? You emit 1 ton, you offset by planting a tree, so you reach net zero. Now, as Lavanya also stressed, we have no more time for net zero for the rich world. Next. So the Paris Agreement, and I'll just skip this, is just to say what Alizan said in the beginning. It's about this is a global aspiration. It doesn't refer to a country-wise aim. But the way it is being proposed is as if everyone has to do this. Next, please. Now, examples of Western emissions. There are many analyses of the fair shares approach from the academics and CSOs, and these are some aspects that we have highlighted. US emissions peaked in 2005 and declined at an average of 1.1% from then till 2017. Even if it reaches net zero by 2050, its cumulative emissions between 2018 and 2050 would be 106 gigatons of CO2, which is 22% of the total remaining carbon budget of the whole world. So high that unless others reduce emissions at a faster rates, the 1.5 warming limit will not be possible. So to stay within the fair shares of the remaining carbon budget, it would have to reach net zero emissions by 2025, and it still owes a carbon debt of 470 gigatons to the rest of the world. And at a carbon price of $30 per ton of CO2, this is a carbon debt of 14 trillion that the US owes to the world. And for the EU to keep its fair share of the remaining budget, it would have to reach net zero emissions by 2033 with the constant annual reductions in emissions. And the EU has stated that it would reach net zero only in 2050. So what this means is that it would consume at least 71 gigatons of CO2, well above its fair share. So this really, next slide please, this really shows how we need to understand this issue. And the net component means that countries can continue polluting and delay climate action while relying on the irresponsible notion that vast amounts of carbon they release will be sucked out by some method, and a lot of it is actually to be done offsets in developing countries. So we are very critical of carbon trading offset schemes, which actually mean that these countries can continue with their emissions without making the dramatic reductions necessary and still claim to be on track to net zero, even if they use up the remaining carbon budget. And in developing countries will have to do more emissions reductions over and above the carbon credits that they will sell to developed countries in achieving their own NDCs. So this is really inequity of the highest order. Next, please. And as Lavanya said, there is this big push for nature-based solutions in the international discourse. There's been a huge debate in civil society and movements. So the net zero pledges are not being grounded in the deep carbonization that rely on nature-based solutions with or without offsetting. And they create a huge demand for nature-based solutions. No published research exists yet that adds up the quantities of the carbon removal that make up the net zero pledges of corporations and countries. And the quantity is likely to exceed the sequestration capacity of the planet by several fold. And much of the sequestration capacity is in the sinks of the developing world. And this is a very serious concern because it will, what looks positive can balloon into negative implications in relation to developing countries, particularly in terms of the land use conflicts and also the rights of indigenous peoples and local communities. Next, please. So what is required for Malaysia from the global level? So Malaysia has to meet its Paris Agreement obligations consistent with equity and CBDR. And there is also an obligation that all parties should strive to communicate long-term GHG development strategies. So insisting on the CBDR principle is not to shy away from climate action, but to ensure that as a developing country, Malaysia taps into the international resources available for doing our climate actions where domestic resources are not adequate. This is no longer an environmental negotiation. It's the transformation of your economy in total. But many of our political leaders and our states, they have absolutely no idea. They think they can carry on with business as usual. But if we are really to do the transformation that is needed, we have to tap into the international funds. And part of this is because if you look at the pandemic and the effects, now at the subsidiary body discussions just in the last 3 weeks, we've been hearing developing countries have been saying about more and more of their national budgets going to rescuing collapsing and collapsed health systems, rising debt levels, unemployment, economic catastrophe. So now you want to go and talk about climate change. Who in this country will have any appetite to do this? So I think this is a reality we face, but it's not an excuse for inaction. So what we need to do is really to push to do our fair share of the effort, which also means that we need to implement the fair shares at a national level. We have to step up our adaptation efforts, as Lavanya is saying, and address loss and damage. We have to go to the international funds which are available. And we must also ensure that it has a strong voice in coalition with other developing countries at the UNFCCC and the Paris Agreement processes, including in the forthcoming COP26 meeting, to ensure that the implementation of commitments agreed to at the multilateral level will actually relate to the climate finance, technology transfer, and capacity building are met. And I'm a bit disappointed that Malaysia's engagement has not been as active as it ought to be, as it was in the run-up to the Paris Agreement. Next, please. So this is where I end. Can I go back to the screen? And I just have a final thought. If you want to reach TWN, you can reach there. You can go back to the main screen. No need the PowerPoint anymore. Yeah. So the point I want to stress actually is that there is a lot to do. This is not about an excuse, but I think it has to be just. There's also a conversation now about just transition. It's about economic diversification. We in Equitable Network actually did a study on Petronas. 20% of our revenue is actually coming from Petronas, and it's relying on gas. And if you look at what that means in terms of the future, I think we actually need to talk about the phase out of fossil fuels in a way that ensures just transition, economic diversification, and as Alizan alluded, the carbon border measures that are being advanced. When the rich countries have also already got rich in an unfettered, without limiting carbon dioxide emissions. Today, we are all being constrained not to emit, and that is the right way. But how do you do it when you have the G7 continue to allow the expansion of fossil fuels and fossil fuel subsidies and the trillions which are going into fossil fuel subsidies? Now, I mean, it is doublespeak, and that's why many of us are very concerned that we have to have the national and the international context in perspective as we pursue both ambition on all fronts and equity as well, because that is the heart of international cooperation. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Meena. I think you raised some very, very difficult and serious questions that have to be answered in terms of climate justice and climate fairness, especially when it comes to developed country interactions at these international commitments, at these international conferences. What we're going to do now is we're going to shift into the Q&A section. Now, I know we have received a number of questions from the audience. Thank you for those questions and keep them coming in. What we'll do first is we'll go through a few questions that I prepared for the speakers, and then once we run through those, we'll shift to the Q&A from the audience, if that's okay. So I'm going to start with a very, very simple and straightforward question in the context of this discussion. How would you judge Malaysia's existing NDC? So the main goal is to reduce the emissions intensity of GDP by 35% relative to 2005 levels and 45% reduction contingent on foreign technology transfer and financial aid. And to follow up on that question, how would you score Malaysia on the achievement of our NDC? So how close are we to achieving this 35% reduction? And what are some of the obstacles that remain in reaching these goals? And any of the speakers who feel comfortable answering any part of these questions can go ahead.
Okay, let me start, Darshan. I think Malaysia's emissions are tracked in our national communications and the biennial update reports. So that would be the place to actually look at how we are faring. They're a bit dated in the sense that it goes back in time, but these are complex, very complex calculations that need to be made. I mean, to be accurate. So there is a need for processing that information, for acquiring the data, and so on. So I think the latest data that we have dates back to either 2016 or 2018. I'm not sure. 2016 probably. And at that, I think it's said about 29%. So that, I mean, I don't, that's those are the figures that we have available. What are the challenges? I mean, there are a lot of technologies out there, I believe, that can actually help countries like ours, maybe where we are at a place where we can more easily transition to better or low carbon pathways than maybe countries who have systems that are more entrenched. But those technologies are not easily available. I mean, these are locked up in patents and so on. And I'd like to draw the analogy with what we are facing with COVID now. This is a global problem. Now, if vaccines are going to be, locked up in patents, we are all going to suffer at the end of the day. Likewise, with, some of these technologies, I mean, we have to look at it from a bigger global perspective and say, it's cooperation that matters, not competitiveness. We have to cooperate together and we have to unlock those things together. We have to work together. So, I mean, you should put that, our survival first and foremost, not about, whether we are going to make more profits and, how it's going to be locked up in intellectual property rights and so on. So I think that, to my mind, is one of the key challenges, and we need global cooperation to unlock that.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Lavanya. Any comments from Datin Sri Sunita or Ms. Meena?
Well, I'm not so comfortable commenting about our NDCs, but definitely I can say that in the private sector, there are a lot of businesses that are looking at reducing their emissions, setting their own climate ambition, but it is a very long journey. And the technologies that are available for sequestration aren't available at scale right now. So I think this is a huge challenge that they're facing.
Go ahead.
Yeah, no, I just want to say that we can do better. I honestly think that we can do better. I think to some extent that what's happening in CASA recently on the climate change law, proposals for engaging stakeholders in relation to the NDCs and their formulation, And I think we need to do much more of this, and also private sector and so on. The government cannot work in isolation. And unfortunately, there's a tendency to silo, government engagement, from civil society engagement to private sector engagement. I think this is not a good approach. So I do think that civil society and social movements, many of us actually working on the ground, I see a lot of my civil society groups who are actually on this list of who are participating, doing fantastic work, from agroecology with local communities, indigenous peoples, to mangrove rehabilitation, to many initiatives. And this is something that should be encouraged and gotten on board. And so I do think that there's a lot of potential to tap. And the opportunity is phenomenal, but I think we're not doing enough in cashing in on the potential and the opportunity.
Thank you, Ms. Mina. So you mentioned there are a lot of opportunities out there. What do you consider some of the most significant challenges that Malaysia faces in terms of actually mitigating our emissions and transitioning to a low carbon economy? So, for example, we know that about half of our emissions come from just the electricity and transport sectors. So what sort of actions do you see being necessary within these sectors to drive reductions in total emissions? And should we perhaps be looking at setting targets and making commitments to reduce emissions in these sectors as part of our NDCs, rather than just saying we wish to reduce emissions by 35% relative to 2005? What are your thoughts?
Who are you asking, Darshan?
It's open to any three of you to give your responses. Maybe we can start with you, Ms. Mina, since you answered to the last question.
No, I do think that if you look at the NDC, they look at sectors. There are various sectors. I think we do need to look at the renewable energy sector. I'm told that we are on the road to meeting the NDC roadmap. But we need to learn a lot more about how exactly that is translating. So all of us on this forum are very reluctant to answer these questions, because we are not the government and we don't have information to all that. And so we don't want to trip ourselves and say something that we don't know. But what we do know is that there are conversations happening, but they need to, for instance, Third World Network, WWF and others, we have been called to look at the NDC updating in relation to mitigation, in relation to adaptation. So there are some steps that are moving, and again, to repeat again and again, we can do better and faster.
May I add to that? Yeah, following from what Mina just said, I think that's also the reason why WWF and BCG, we are doing this study. It's to give a perspective, a proper analysis on what we can do, how we can do it, and how to effectively do it, making sure that, as Mina mentioned earlier, that transition is equitable, it's just, it's smooth. So you can't do these kind of things overnight, You need to study, you have to have a long-term perspective, and very importantly, it has to be this whole of society engagement. Mina has already touched on a lot of the excellent work that's being done on the community. Sunita has talked about private sector. All of these, all of us have to come together and also help the government in creating these actually achievable targets. And that's why we are doing the study, and we are doing it in an open way to engage with as many stakeholders as possible to get proper data, in-depth analysis, to help the government in making commitments that are meet all these criteria.
Thank you, Ms. Mina. Thank you, Mr. Lavanya. So I noticed we've got a lot of questions now from the floor. So what we'll do, I think, is start to answer some of those. Nazran, would you like to get the ball rolling with these? Thank you.
Yes, Darshan, thank you very much. So thank you, Darshan, and thank you to all our discussants for their very informative and crucial insights to this all-important topic. So yes, we've got quite a number of questions, but of course, you can keep the questions coming. What I'll try to do is take a couple or so questions and ask the panel, and we'll have a few rounds of these. But I would first like to focus on maybe a very unique predicament Malaysia finds itself in right now, and that's our seemingly inherent political instability. So with Malaysia's political instability since, I guess it's fair to say GE 2018, how would that affect Malaysia's aims in terms of climate change goals, sustainability goals in the coming years going forward? And if possible, I'd like to hear from all the speakers on this topic, on this question. Thank you.
So we've been engaging closely with the government, but we are working to depoliticize the process and working mainly with senior civil servants. There's a tremendous amount of corporate memory. There are civil servants that have spent decades, virtually all of their working life, in service to society. So I think, and a lot of these thoughts, suggestions are not new to them. So they are busy trying to find a delicate balance between what society needs, and especially in the last year, where saving lives and maintaining livelihoods has been a top priority, and of course sustainability, which they also view as being a medium-term priority as well. And especially so as a trading nation, where we're facing headwinds from our trading partners and from allocators of capital that they want to see increased climate ambition against this backdrop. So definitely within government, they've been hard at work. They understand the issues. They are trying to balance priorities. It is not an easy call at all, but they are earnest, hardworking, responsible, conscientious people there. And we are honored to be working with them, actually.
Thank you, Datuk Sri. Maybe Ms. Mina, any thoughts on the political situation and how it might impact our sustainability goals?
I think it's a very good question, but only to say that our experience has been, it doesn't matter whether it's Pakatan Harapan or whether it is PN. Unfortunately, they all don't have a very a clear idea of climate change. They are doing completely the opposite of what the policies are. There are a lot of policies. Malaysia is very good at policies. And many of us are fighting on the front line of these struggles. But, in the last 1-2 months or 3 months, massive efforts going on. And it's a policy incoherence even within the Ministry of Natural Resources itself. On the one hand, you want to protect the forest. On the other hand, you have a national mining policy, which is allowing mining in forest reserves. So the Prime Minister, on the one hand, launches a national biodiversity plan and a national forestry policy. Oh, we have to protect the central forest pine. We need to do this. We need to do that. We all clap. The next day, you completely go and do another, another launching of completely the opposite. So there is no coherence. And I think this is where there is a problem. So the lack of coherence in mainstreaming, it's an often used word, but I do think that there is not enough political attention right from the top, right down to the states, on what climate change and biodiversity actually means in terms of helping us to make that transition and the path to being environmentally sound. As I said, it's not about, and we talk about sustainable development, just add the word sustainable and you think you're sustainable. But we cannot go on, a lot of problems. And the final comment I'd make as civil society, because I'm also Sahabat Alam Malaysia's president, we worry because a lot of these sectors are in the forestry sector, in the mining sector. We have to also say that governance is an issue. How do you make decisions? How do you de-gazette forests? How do you decide who to give what concession to? I mean, these are live issues. So we have to deal with it. Governance is at the center. And all this is not going to happen. So as I said, doesn't matter whether you have Pakatan Harapan or Perikatan, whatever. Yeah. What you need is strong, socially progressive civil society and climate justice movement. We have to make the demand so that when you have your Adon or your MP coming to your area and saying that, I want to, I need your support. You say, no, you stop this reclamation project. You stop this degazetting of this forest. We cannot agree with that. Now that is the kind of agitation we need. So we need to agitate. And so I'm not sure whether people will agree with me, but from my experience over the last how many years, we are at the receiving end of fighting the same problem. So it doesn't matter which political party, because all of them have very close relations with the bad corporate sector. And that, I think, is important. Who is driving the agenda? Who is financing the political campaigns? We need to get to that.
Okay, thank you very much, Ms. Mina, for that very detailed answer. Ms. Lavanya, any thoughts on this topic?
Yeah, very interesting, fascinating topic, and I'd just like to add to what Mina and Sunita have said already. Totally agree. Yes, there are very dedicated, members in the civil society, in civil society as well as in the civil service, who are, thinking the long term, whilst the political scene is so short term, and it works only on short term expediencies. For one. And there's the schizophrenia as well, as Mina has already pointed out. Even within the policies that we have nice policies, but they are often, even within a particular ministry, sort of conflicting policies and plans and so on. In the 11th Malaysia Plan, for example, we had the example of wanting to have a target for emissions reductions, but at the same time, when it came to energy security, we were going to increase our coal power plants, right? So this kind of dichotomy has always been here, schizophrenia. But actually now I think we need to delve a bit deeper into what is the root cause. And I honestly think it's how we measure progress. We are constantly, gunning for GDP growth, and we are living, I think it's very clear, very apparent, we are living in an abundant but finite planet. So this narrative of continuously growing and using material resources that Mother Earth provides ceaselessly has to stop. And there are movements in that direction, but we need to accelerate it, and political will really has to adopt it and embrace it. We've been starting to hear about priorities being given to ensuring planetary health. Now that's good sound bites, but we want that to be translated. We want that to be translated into our economy shifting into an impact-driven economy, right? Impact meaning impact to people, actually giving value to people, real value, not suddenly finding that when a crisis like the COVID happens, a lot of people are left, with nothing to, left exposed, right? And impact to the environment, positive impact to the environment. Now, if we put that as a focus, the solutions are there. But we are not putting that as a focus. We are putting ceaseless growth still as a focus. And so the other thing that also needs to happen is probably also improving our national accounts, macroeconomic accounting. The national accounts, there are ways now to include things like, satellite accounts to account for, what's happening with the environment. And I believe even in the 11th Malaysia Plan, there was some satellite accounts that have already been developed. These are the kind of things that we need to push to make sure that what we are doing is comprehensive, and that political will for that needs to be there.
Okay, thank you very much to all the speakers for your detailed answers. What I'll do now is go to the second round, and I've got more specific tailored questions for each speaker. So firstly for Datin Sri, Ms. Zida Fatima asked, you mentioned about business stepping up as thought leaders in low carbon transitions. So in the context of Malaysia specifically, which companies or specific actor can play a role as the prime movers in this effort in galvanizing the business community and connecting them to those pressing national as well as global aspirations? So that's for Datin Sri. As for Ms. Mina and Ms. Lavanya, there's a very popular topic in the Q&A, which is on the nature-based approach that I believe Ms. Lavanya mentioned just now. So countries have not agreed on a unified definition of nature-based approach. If there are such differing views and understanding on something as fundamental as its definition, how can countries even take a stronger and more meaningful ambition to operationalize this on the climate response measures? So yes, maybe Datin Sri can answer that specific question for her, and then proceed to Ms. Lavanya and then Ms. Mina for the question on nature-based approach. Thanks.
Okay, So the companies which have been stepping up, and this is the CEO Action Network and Climate Governance Malaysia initiative, the series of roundtables, details of which you'll be able to find on the website. So for the energy sector, the planning committee comprises representatives from Petronas, Shell, and Tenaga, and we're using Shell's blue sky scenario as the basis for the kickoff, which is going to happen in a few weeks' time. This is just a planning committee. The representatives are from much wider range of stakeholders. For the property sector, it's Saim Darby, Reda, Wan Utama, Green RE. For the plantation sector, it's Dr. Kala from FGB, Dr. Alina, Saim Darby Plantations. And from the recycling sector, Maria, which has 10 members, is very much involved in this space already. And of course, we have the support from organizations like MGTCP, WC, CIMB, Microsoft, and ISIS, we're pleased to say, DG, Heineken, Westport. So there are a number of organizations where the leaders see very clearly that not only this is the right thing to do, but also that it could give them a competitive edge by being early to the discussion. So it's managing risk, but it's also a potential business opportunity for them.
Thanks. Ms. Lavanya, on the nature-based approach questions.
Sure. But before that, I'd just like to add a few more organizations to the list, that great list that Sunita's already mentioned. EPF actually announced that they want to make sustainability central to their investment portfolio by 2030. That's a policy. So I mean that's really encouraging when you have an investor sort of do that. It drives down the message. Bank Negara Malaysia and Securities Commission have this joint committee on climate change. So the banking sector is also, stepping up. And again, this is where we can really see, positive movement. Also with the value-based intermediation, which looks at value, defines value broadly, more broadly than just profits, to include value to society, value to the environment. So these are actions, as well as Bursa trying to improve on their ESG criteria. So I think these are also very positive movements towards encouraging the corporate Malaysia to do more. Now to answer the question on nature-based solutions, just to say that you're right, Zida, thanks for raising that. Indeed, yes, the definition is a very big problem, and Mina has already touched on it, in terms of what it might become, what it might morph to from the international context if we are not careful in properly defining it. But as NGO WWF, we support using nature-based solutions, using very clear guidelines. Okay, so as I mentioned briefly, nature-based solutions are solutions that address a variety of societal challenges, climate change being one of them. And when you look at climate change, it's also adaptation and climate mitigation that one solution. For example, replanting mangroves could achieve. You can have carbon sequestration as well as adaptation to coastal erosion, all happening together whilst also providing food security, because mangroves are fisheries, a nursery for fish. So these are multiple benefits that nature-based solutions can provide, but we have to be very clear in terms of the criteria that's applied in deciding what qualifies to be nature-based solutions. Now, IUCN has come up with a list of criteria. WWF has also come up with, with some additional requirements, because we have to understand also one very important thing. Nature is a magic bullet, but if we don't look out for how we are progressing in terms of limiting temperature rise, that magic bullet is going to go. As I mentioned, coral reefs will disappear really literally with a 2-degree world. So we are talking about our very defense mechanisms being eroded if we don't actually take the strong action we need to take now. That being said, these criteria, nature-based solutions, provide a multiple variety of benefits. But first and foremost, when it comes to climate mitigation, the thing that NGOs lot of civil society harp on over and over again is emissions have to be cut at source first and foremost to the maximum level possible. To the maximum level possible. As Meena already mentioned, if we are going to continue emitting and rely on, this carbon sequestration potential of forests, impossible. There's not enough land for that kind of sequestration potential to begin with. Okay, so first and foremost, really the hierarchy must be cut at source as far as possible, and then this nature-based solutions offers, the ability to bring it down to zero globally by the mid-century, whilst offering many other societal benefits.
Thank you. Ms. Meena?
Yeah, I agree with what Lavanya has been saying. And on also the positive side about the new actors, the Bursa and the Bank Negara, the financial actors, I think that's really fantastic. And the financing is driving the agenda, which is really important. I just wanted to compliment what Lavanya is saying. I think at the end of the day, I think that this big fight internationally is really because there is no, there's a suspicion always. What does it mean? What is the agenda? Whose carbon? Whose solution? What are we doing? Who's the driver of this? I think these are all very important questions. And just to say, the context is really about the carbon markets. That's where the fear is. Because right now, one of the biggest deals in COP26 is supposed to be what's called the Article 6 mechanism, what they call the internationally transferred mitigation outcomes. They don't use the word carbon markets, but it is internationally transferred mitigation outcomes. ITMOs. I've said many times that it sounds like a mosquito. Yeah. But many of the developing countries don't know what it means. And they are negotiating what they don't mean. They don't understand. So what does it mean? How does it work? So right now in Malaysia, we know about the REDD Plus financing. Yeah. Some of us have been engaging with KESA on this. So the forest carbon offset, the forest, the credit, and so on. Now you're dealing with carbon, which is an intangible. It's intangible. So if you were dealing with a car, or you're dealing with a leaf, or you're dealing with, it's tangible. You're dealing with a carbon credit, which is intangible. That's why a lot of us are very worried, because what are you measuring? And in fact, that's why we constantly say, if you look at Interpol, International Police, they've got a paper, which actually says there's massive fraud that has happened before. In the voluntary sector as well. So you have different standards, gold standards, non-gold standards, fraud, speculators, secondary market. So it's all about financialization of commodities. So it's I think we need to be aware about this new financialization. And that's what we are worried about, a new instrument. So Japan is knocking on our doors to do offsets in our country with our nature. Yeah. What does that mean? What does it mean for us? How do we implement our own NDCs? Do we have a policy? How do we measure? How do we regulate? So one of the things that we are waiting to see is what will be the REDD Plus standards that will come out. Because to be honest with you, and I'm sorry that sometimes I'm quite critical, but I don't think we can run away from the fact that capacity is lacking in terms of high governance and ethics and monitoring. Even when you see Sungai Kim Kim, years dumping of toxic waste, it goes on. Logging which goes on and nobody knows, and suddenly social media is a buzz. So I do think that there's a lot for us. So if we don't have, somebody pointed this out during the negotiations, not the discussions that went on virtually on the Article 6. Developing countries have not engaged in this. They have no idea what the infrastructure is. They have no idea what it means. Who is going to be making sure that all this works? And are we going in the right direction? It's voluntary, of course, but are we going in with eyes that we know? Because many of the states are running to the carbon markets. Oh, I got new money. They're going to offer me this, and the carbon cowboys are coming knocking on their doors. So they're willing to engage and say, oh, okay, I'm going to go. But what does that mean? What does that mean? There's no whole of government approach, no holistic approach. So we need to understand all this. And so it's not easy, it's complicated, even in the negotiations, as I said. I don't know how, and by the way, the last thing I will say on this is, they are convening, the COP26 presidency is convening a ministerial level discussion next week, ministers engaging on what is an ITMO and how to solve the problem of the mechanisms. I mean, can you imagine going to our ministers and explaining to them carbon credits and Article 6?
Thank you, Ms. Mina, for your very frank and honest answer. I guess it ties in very well with our next question, which I think we've got a couple more questions, which will be part of a final round. So specifically for Ms. Lavanya and Ms. Mina, there's a question here about the need or the importance of a climate change act, because that's what Malaysia has been talking about in recent years. And do you think we still need a climate change legislation, and will this actually address our problems, i.e. those entities working in silos? And specifically for Datin Sri Sudita, there's a question here from Mr. Tan about with your experience and interactions with the corporate world, what is your sense with regards to their main hesitancy or challenges with regards to adopting sustainability and sustainable measures? Does it actually make economic sense to them? And if not, or if it does, what other incentives do you think are needed for them to adopt these sustainability measures? So if maybe Ms. Mina could answer question first about climate change legislation. Thanks. Sorry, Ms. Mina?
Oh, sorry.
Yeah,
You're asking me to answer this question?
About climate change, the legislation.
The legislation.
Yes, that one's
I am not sure where this discussion is going. I'm not sure, because at one time we heard that the current Environmental Quality Act is going to be amended to also include climate change concerns, so that you don't have to go through a whole new thing, when it would be easier to do this in terms of CO2 emissions and all that. And then we heard about a possibility of a climate change legislation. I think we need to, the devil is really in the details. I think we do need legislation, and we do need to focus, because otherwise there is no driver, because in this country you do need to have a legal based system which actually ensures that that there is regulation and this and that. So yeah, I'm not so sure where we are in this discussion at the moment in the ministry. Better to have Dr. Nagu answer this.
Okay, thank you, Dr. Mina. Ms. Lavanya, your thoughts on the need for climate change legislation?
I would totally agree with what Mina has just said. Insofar as we know, I mean, I think Mina's already spelled out what we know in terms of this initiative in the country. I think there's also a study being undertaken now on carbon pricing and how feasible that would be. So these are all the pieces I think the government wants to study first before coming up probably with legislation. And what that scope of that legislation would be, what it needs to cover. But indeed, there is a need to bring a more comprehensive approach, integrated approach, and a piece of legislation would probably help to shape that, rather than doing things in silo.
Okay, thanks. Datin Sri, the question in regards to sustainability in the corporate sector.
Why the hesitation? I think in general, private sector is looking to government for signaling, including policies, legal framework, and all of this will take time. So if that hasn't even started, then private sector is taking a wait and see approach. However, there are a lot of conversations. I think there's recognition that rich countries should be reaching their climate targets years earlier than developing countries, and provide support for greening efforts of developing countries, whether via funding or in kind. I think there is recognition that while rich countries are cutting their emissions, some developing countries are going to continue to increase theirs unless they can gain far more investment in shifting to a low carbon economy. I think there is also recognition that other countries have their own priorities, and we need to be fully prepared to negotiate accordingly. The distribution of vaccines has been instructive. How effective the Montreal Protocol and CFCs, because the depletion of ozone layer affected some countries more. So all of this is instructive. But there is also recognition that Malaysia is a trading nation. It is a significant contributor in the global supply chain, and Standard Chartered has estimated that 57% of multinationals are willing to replace emerging market suppliers with ones in developed markets that are less reliant on fossil fuels if it would help them reach zero. And 31% of MNCs have a zero tolerance approach in their supply chain. They will just remove suppliers that endanger their transition. So if you recognize that science says that we need to cut absolute emissions by half very soon, then intensity-only targets are not going to be sufficient. It might even be incompatible with limiting climate change. So we really need to think hard about what is what is needed currently. If you do think that this is an existential crisis, if you do feel that this part of the world is going to be disproportionately affected, if you feel that we are lagging in adaptation efforts, if we are lacking in access to real-time granular data, which can lead to better informed decisions and better allocation of capital, if you think that our products and goods are no longer going to be welcome in our largest trading partners who have declared climate ambition, then carrying on in the existing trajectory is a race to the bottom. And do we want to be part of this race? So I think that's something, yes, there is a hesitation for some parties, but I think these are the tough questions they need to ask themselves.
Thank you to all the panelists for your answers to these very good questions that have been provided by the attendees. So we reached the end of the Q&A, unfortunately. Thank you again to all the attendees for your great questions. I'll pass the floor back to Darshan.
Thank you, Nazran, and thanks all the panelists for your fantastic feedback and thoughts that you've shared on where we are in terms of the fight against climate change, and where we're going and where we perhaps should go as well. And thank you to the audience as well for the questions. There are a lot of good questions here still that unfortunately we don't have the time to go through them right now. But what I will do now is I'll hand over to Datin Sri Sunita for any short closing remarks if she has any. Following that, Alizan will give his closing remarks and then we'll close the session.
Thank you. I just want to stress, and also from looking at the profile of some of the questions where it is, what is the government doing and how can it do more? I do want to stress that this really needs to be a partnership. It needs to be an all of government, whole of society approach. Without the mobilization of large private investment in adaptation to develop climate resilience, we are not going to get there because there simply isn't enough money in the public sector to make this transition happen. The private sector is going to have to figure out how to make itself much more resilient, how to adapt to the climate as it changes going forward. To paraphrase from Puan Medellina of Bank Negara, who said, the effects are irreversible with far-reaching consequences. We need a collective response from various stakeholders because by the time this becomes the defining issue for financial stability, it's going to be too late. So we need a whole of nation approach for an orderly and accelerated transition.
Thank you, Datin Sri Sunita. Alizan?
Okay, thank you, Darshan, and thank you to all the speakers and all the audience as well for giving such thought-provoking insights as well as questions as well from the audience. I think just by way of closing remarks, I won't summarize, but I think we began by really painting the picture of how complex, especially the international negotiation at the global stage is in terms of climate change and in relation how Malaysia should respond. And I think the speakers did a really amazing job in untangling parts of those complexity and complex questions. But nonetheless, what is clear is that there is unfortunately no silver bullet. There is no holy grail. And sometimes in climate change, we try to find that simple and singular answer. And unfortunately, there isn't. For example, again, the question of net zero emissions. In principle, there's no problem with it, but if it's done incorrectly, if it's implemented incorrectly, it will just result back to what happened previously with polluting industries, where developing countries just relocate their polluting industries to developing countries and so on. So that really we need to be careful with all these broad generalizations and so on, especially when you talk about ambitions and targets. The ambitions and targets themselves perhaps there's nothing wrong with them, but the design of how we achieve those targets is really important, especially when we talk about moving to the national level as well. But moving forward, this complexity is really not an excuse for inaction. In fact, perhaps it's the opposite. Because of this complexity, I think we've heard that we really need to, as a nation, have a more nuanced view of climate change, of the strategies, of how we address these issues. So we cannot anymore, again, talk about generalizations in terms of policy aspirations. We have a lot of policies, as mentioned, but we really need to really craft the pathways towards addressing climate action. This is whether it be a systemic view, like Lavanya mentioned, talking about going beyond GDP, talking about planetary health, or really the concrete implementation level, focusing on even the issues that we have in Malaysia, going from the federal policies to state implementation to local level implementation and so on. So I think really there is a need to have more nuanced, more specific strategy to some of the issues of climate change. And with this, I think we highlighted that process is important. I think all the speakers mentioned this, that Sri Sunita as well mentioned, the all of government, whole of nation approach. Government cannot do this alone, and therefore the process to really craft these pathways is very important, especially when we talk about just transition and so on. I think we need to have that process, and I hope what we have organized today is one small part, but a part of that process to get the discussion going. And I hope the update of the nationally determined contributions, NDCs, is part of that larger process where we get the different viewpoints and we get the buy-in and consensus of how we need to move forward. So I think with that, I thank you once again to our esteemed speakers, to Sri Sunita, Ms. Mina, Ms. Lavanya, for really contributing very critical thoughts and thought-provoking insights into our topic today. And I thank all of you for joining us today from your homes in this COVID period. Stay safe. And thank you once again, and join us for our other webinars. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Alizan.
Thank you.
Yeah, Lisa. Thank you, everyone.